al prossimo evento. Tutti voi sapete che adesso sono circa le 4:40, in realtà sono 3 minuti alla mezzanotte. 3 minuti alla mezzanotte perché sono 70 anni che il mondo è minacciato dalle armi atomiche, dagli attacchi a Hiroshima fino ai primi test delle bombe a idrogeno. Il tempo della vita sulla Terra è stato scandito esattamente da questa minaccia delle armi atomiche. Qui a Wired NXT oggi raccontiamo cosa significa che mancano 3 minuti a mezzanotte, cioè che la fine del mondo si avvicinerà fra 3 minuti. Per farlo abbiamo con noi John Mecklin del Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, che invito a salire sul palco. Perché mancano 3 minuti a mezzanotte? Per farvelo capire vi mostriamo un video che vi introdurrà a come le lancette dell'orologio dell'Apocalisse si sono spostate negli ultimi 70 anni a oggi. E poi la parola a John Mecklin. Grazie.
Okay, thank you all. My name's John Mecklin. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and I do Doom. That's what I do for a living. The Bulletin covers 3 forms of what we call existential threats to humanity. The first, which we've covered since 1945, is nuclear weapons. There are 10,000 nuclear weapons in the world. And this is not actually your grandfather's problem. They are very real. Our boards think that the nuclear situation is as dangerous today as it's ever been. We also cover climate change as an existential threat to humanity. The planet essentially uninhabitable for anybody. And we've got a third set of existential risks that we deal with also. It is, they're called emerging technological threats. I guess the sexiest is killer robots, if you think killer robots are sexy. There's biological threats to humanity, a new form of inserting genes into organisms called CRISPR, which could spread, for instance, diseases with no cures across the planet really quickly. So that those are a whole set of technologies that our board members think could end humanity, as they develop. So now that I've depressed you all by saying what we cover, I wanted to assure you that what I actually am bringing here is a message of hope. The idea of the bulletin is to manage these existential risks to humanity, and I hope to get all of you interested, not the doom part of this, but the part of making it so that we never do hit midnight on the Doomsday clock. But to get to the the positive side, the hopeful side of the bulletin, I sort of need to go back to its beginnings. It was founded in 1945, just a few months after the United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scientists who had created the bomb, including Albert Einstein and a set of Manhattan Project scientists, formed the bulletin thinking that world leaders and world citizens just, did not understand that atomic weaponry was something different in the history of the world. All the armaments made up to that point could not end humanity, and nuclear weapons could. And at this time, shortly after founding the bulletin, Albert Einstein was interviewed in the New York Times, and he emphasized that had changed everything about life on Earth except the way human beings think. And he called for a new way of thinking, and that is really what the bulletin is all about spreading a new way of thinking so that humanity is preserved. The Doomsday Clock was created in 1947, and it's almost by accident. It was the scientists who ran the bulletin decided they needed a cover. They were going to make it into a magazine. And one of the scientists was married to an artist, Marta Langsdorff, and she created a design with just a clock with the minute hand, 7 minutes till midnight, to sort of indicate that the world didn't have much time to deal with nuclear weapons. This clock has come to be perhaps the most successful information graphic of the 20th century and into the 21st. It is known all around the world, but what is the Doomsday Clock? Well, for one thing, it's not a physical clock, although people show up at the University of Chicago at our home base all the time asking to see the Doomsday Clock. And we don't send them on snipe hunts or anything. We explain patiently that there is no physical clock. The clock is everywhere. It is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the security state of the world. How close are we to destroying ourselves with our own technologies? And I wanted to, since I'm going to be talking about this a little bit through today, I wanted to make clear the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is anything but anti-technology. It's run by scientists, after all, and technologists. But what it is fervently for is the proper management of technology. So this clock was created just sort of as a lark, to be on the cover, and they weren't even sure how long they were going to use it. They didn't know the hand was going to move on the clock. But then in 1949, the Soviet Union set off its first atomic weapon. That scared the editor of the bulletin, and he decided, well, we're going to move the hand to 5 minutes to midnight, closer to midnight, to tell the world that it is in more danger than it was before the Soviet Union acquired atomic weaponry. Since then, the hands of the clock have moved 20 times. The closest it was to midnight was 2 minutes to midnight. That was in 1953 when the United States exploded its first hydrogen bomb, many tens of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And then just months later, the Soviet Union set off its first hydrogen bomb. That caused the leaders of the bulletin to set the clock at 2 minutes to midnight. The furthest away from doomsday the clock has been is 17 minutes. That's in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved, and everybody thought it was the end of the Cold War, that the nuclear menace would be easily solved then because, you know, there was no more Soviet Union, there was no more reason for East and West to fight. an interesting fact about the clock is that in 1962, for the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to destroying itself with nuclear weapons. The hands of the clock did not move. Our leaders thought, well, it happened in October. The decision on moving the hands usually happens in November or December. They didn't know enough about the Cuban Missile Crisis at that time. And then the next year, they actually moved the hands of the clock away from midnight because the United States and the Soviet Union had set up a hotline, the first communication between the powers that would stop the, hopefully, a nuclear war in progress. The Bulletin has been covering climate change for a long time. This was the first cover of the magazine that I could find that dealt with climate change. That was in 1978, so we were a little bit ahead of the curve there. The climate change was added to the deliberations on the clock in 2007, and since then, in the last 5 years or so, since I've become editor, our boards have also started considering the emerging threats. The artificial intelligence, you may have heard Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and others talk about the threat of artificial intelligence, essentially intelligence that can learn itself and maybe get too smart to need human beings. That even lesser advances in artificial intelligence, if incorporated into military weapons, what some call lethal autonomous weapons, or in the vernacular, killer robots. These things started to be considered by our boards. And the clock is set every year in November. Our Science and Security Board is a set of 12 to 15 top experts around the world in nuclear weapons, climate change, and emerging technologies. They meet during the summer and then again in November. In November, they meet for most of a day. The meetings are fascinating. Experts from all these fields present their in-depth research on what's happened in the world in those areas. And this year, they kept the hands of the clock at 3 minutes till midnight. That is the same place those hands were in the early 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States and calling Russia, the Soviet Union, an evil empire, and both sides were moving intermediate range nuclear missiles into Europe. It's a very dangerous time in history, and our boards think that the current situation is just as dangerous. This year, they decided to keep the hands at 3 minutes to midnight, even though there were a couple of positive things they saw in the world. In the nuclear area, the Iran agreement between 6 world powers and Iran to control nuclear weapons, the nuclear program in Iran. Our Science and Security Board decided that that was a minor positive, as was the Paris Climate Accords, which called on 196 countries around the world, all pledged to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. This is the first time this has been done, and our boards said, well, that's a positive too. And then they said, and we're keeping the hands at 3 minutes till midnight, indicating the world is in great peril because those positive things happened within a world that is extremely dangerous, and particularly the nuclear realm. As I said earlier, a lot of younger people think that nuclear weapons, the nuclear tension between Russia and the United States is something that was solved back when, that it's your father's or grandfather's problem. But the reality right now is that the United States and Russia are at each other's throats over the Ukraine, Syria, missile defense, and they have 90% of the 10,000 weapons in the world. And they are both engaged in what is called nuclear modernization. So they are spending just vast amounts of money making the weapons they have more dangerous, stealthier, so there's great danger in the nuclear level of many of the weapons are on hair trigger alert. I guess the most serious problem to do with nuclear weapons is sort of connected to climate change in a way. There are 10,000 nuclear weapons in the world. If conflict started and 200 of them were set off over cities around the world, that would create a nuclear winter that would affect Italy, it would affect everywhere. It would kill anywhere between tens of millions to hundreds of millions or billions of people because it would cool the planet so much that agriculture would essentially collapse. And there's research to show this. That's the nuclear realm. Our Science and Security Board, in consultation with our board of sponsors, which includes 16 Nobel laureates that really are the top of the top, they looked at the Paris Climate Accords and said it's a great thing, except even if all the countries of the world that agreed to cut their greenhouse gases did so, did everything they said they would do at Paris, the world's temperature would continue to rise and would pass beyond this 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels that most scientists have set as the line beyond which truly serious impacts from climate change occur. So that even if all the countries that said they would do something at Paris did everything, the world would still be in great peril. The climate change would pass into a level where, the last research I saw showed that by 2050 to 2060, if something really isn't done, something serious, we're talking about roughly 10 meters of sea level rise. That's 30 feet for you English-speaking folks. Think about Venice with 10 meters of sea level rise. Think about South Florida in the United States. Think about all the low-lying areas of the world. And that's just sea level. So, there's a real problem with the Paris Climate Accords also in that there's no enforcement mechanism. So it's highly likely that countries won't adhere to it. So our boards think the world is in serious hurt, serious danger. A level of danger that all of you ought to really take into consideration. And I did want to say, I told you folks that this is what I do. I do doom. And I don't mean to depress you all and bum you all out. So now I'm going to move to the hope part of my presentation, and I'm going to shamelessly use some famous people here to try to get you thinking a little different. Because that's what the bulletin is all about. All of these existential threats I've been talking about, nuclear weapons, climate change, these emerging technologies, they were all made by human beings. They aren't like a comet falling out of the sky and ending life on Earth. These are technologies we made. So as a just fact, we can learn to manage them. They are human inventions. We can invent the way to manage them. And this kind of new thinking about how to continue to progress in technology without killing ourselves with our own technology, that's what the bulletin does. That's what we spread, is that kind of new thinking. And, I guess we're getting pretty good at spreading the word about this new kind of thinking. When we announced the change that the hands of the clock stayed at 3 minutes till midnight this January, it was done. We had a live video feed. We had a press conference in Washington, D.C., and one link to it from the West Coast at Stanford with some of our experts. And what they actually announced was, think about this for a minute, what they announced was that nothing was happening to an imaginary clock. They said, we're announcing that we aren't moving the hands of a clock that doesn't really exist. You would think, well, yeah, so who would care about that? Well, 300,000 people watched that presentation in real time. 700,000 watched a video we prepared related to it. We were trending on Facebook. We were trending on Twitter with the Doomsday Clock. Now, it's also, the Doomsday Clock has moved into the world of pop culture big time. I mean, it's been a rock and roll staple since The Who, The Clash, and this year, the CBS hit show Madam Secretary about a fictional U.S. Secretary of State, something like Hillary Clinton. They put out a whole episode built around the Doomsday Clock and how the setting of the Doomsday Clock could affect the president's political future and whatever. So I gave you the doom. Here's my sort of song of joy, my hope. We've proven that we can get the word out widely, that people will actually be interested in preserving humanity. They will be interested in learning about existential threats to humanity and what they can do to keep their kids and their grandkids and their kids alive. And so my real bottom line message to you all, the reason I came here to speak, all the way from California to Milan, Italy, is that you are the Wired Next generation. You know how to think different. That's what you do. You have been doing it since Wired magazine was founded in the mid-1990s. I know, I lived in San Francisco when it was founded, and you're still doing it. You know how to network. You know how to get messages around the world. You know how to use social media to change governments, sometimes even to bring them down. And so what I'd like you to consider is you all have interests in life, really things you think are important, whether that's digital technology, building the next great company, whether you're talking about art or architecture or your kids or whatever. You have things that are important to you. And what I'm asking you to do is to consider placing these existential threats at the top of your priority list, because the simple reality is if we don't deal with nuclear weapons, everything else you care about won't matter, because there won't be any human beings to do any of the things you care about. If we don't get climate change right, almost everything you care about will not exist. We will live in a greatly degraded world where the kind of things you think about will not be what the world is thinking about. The world will be thinking about, where's my next meal coming from? And it's the same thing to do with the emerging technological threats. You all understand new technology. You know that what we call these dual-use technologies, things that have a great positive side, can also have a negative side. And you all are the kind of people who can understand that and think about managing the downside while we benefit from the upside. So that's really the message I bring here today. It's not doom, it's hope. It's that people just like you can read the bulletin, learn about the issues. Believe me, what we write and publish is really, really well done. It's really interesting, and probably a heck of a lot more interesting than this talk I've given you today. Follow us on social media and use your networking powers to tell the world that what you care about, to tell your politicians, to tell your media particularly that you want these issues dealt with, and you are the Wired Next Generation, and I know you can make it happen. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to me.
Grazie a John Mecklin. I have a short question for you.
Okay.
What happens to the Doomsday Clock if Donald Trump becomes president of the United States? I mean,
Well, I don't know. I mean, if that happens, I mean, it would just be the United States version of Berlusconi, I suspect, and he can't last 20 years. I mean, Trump can't because he only get 8 years in the United States to be president. So I'm not sure what our board of experts would do, but I can tell you they actually would consider that because Donald Trump is the least knowledgeable person about the kind of threats I'm talking about of anybody in American politics. He knows nothing about nuclear. He knows nothing about climate change. In fact, just the other day, he called for pulling the United States out of the Paris Accords. So let us, I don't often get political, but let us all hope that Donald Trump is just entertaining and then goes away.
thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot.
Grazie a John Mecklin, editor-in-chief del Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. Wired Next Fest ritorna fra pochissimo dopo l'Apocalisse.